Okay, Bill Campbell back here again. We are now going to be talking about fixed income, some basic concepts. First of all, understanding yield spreads, another exciting topic, so let's get into it. The first thing you need to know about are interest rate policy tools. So what will the central bank, in this case generally the Federal Reserve in the U.S., what kinds of tools do they have for adjusting interest rates? Well, we have three basic tools. We have the discount rate. That's the rate that the Federal Reserve charges member banks to borrow money. So by adjusting that discount rate, if they raise that rate, then it's more expensive for banks to borrow money. Of course, if it's more expensive for the banks to borrow money, then they're going to be lending it out at a higher rate so that they can earn some spread over their borrowing costs. And if they lower the discount rate, then the banks can afford to lower their lending rate as well. So that's a good way of adjusting interest rates. Typically, the discount rate adjusts short-term rates, not necessarily have any effect on long-term rates. So another way that the Fed can adjust interest rates is through what they call open market operations, where they go out into the open market and either buy or sell Treasury securities. Obviously, you can go back to your economics and remember that if they start buying securities on the open market, well, the more buyers you have, generally the price goes higher. If the price on bonds goes higher, the yield on the bonds goes down. So by buying bonds, they will tend to lower interest rates for whatever that maturity of bonds is. Recently, we've seen a lot of what's been referred to as quantitative easing, which is a fancy way of saying that the Fed goes out and instead of buying short-term bonds, they buy long-term bonds, 10-year bonds, for example. And by buying them, they raise the price on 10-year bonds, lower the yield on the 10-year bonds. That tends to lower longer-term interest rates. If they want to raise longer-term interest rates, then they will sell 10-year bonds. The more they sell, the lower the price, the higher the yield. The last tool that they have is the reserve requirement. If they change the reserve requirement, that's the percentage of deposits that member banks have to keep on hand as reserve against people wanting to come and take their money from the bank. And you remember from your economics that we have the multiplier effect, that the amount of money that ends up in circulation increases as the reserve requirement decreases. Now, this is a tool that although the central bank can use this to adjust interest rates, it's one they tend to avoid because small changes in the reserve requirement can cause large changes in the money supply and therefore affect interest rates quite severely. So it's a very sensitive tool that they have, not one that they like to use very much, but it is a possibility. All right, to understand yields, you have to understand the yield curve. Now, the yield curve, notice on the horizontal axis we have time to maturity. On the vertical axis we have yield. So this is a curve that gives us for any different time to maturity. 1 month to maturity, 3 months to maturity, a year to maturity, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, whatever. What is the required yield for that term to maturity? Now, there are several kinds of yield curves. We'll talk about these a little bit later. There's a spot yield curve, and there's a par yield curve, and there's a forward yield curve, and so on. But for the moment, we're going to be concerned not about which specific yield curve we have, but about the shapes of the yield curve. And we have a lot of adjectives to describe the shapes of yield curve. Most of them are fairly straightforward. Flat yield curve, pretty much exactly what the name suggests. It suggests that no matter what the term to maturity, you have approximately the same required yield. So you might have a required yield of 4% if you have a maturity of 2 months, 4% if you have a maturity of 2 years, 4% if you have a maturity of 10 years, 4% if you have a maturity of 30 years. That would be described as a flat yield curve. Normally, most commonly, yield curves show lower required yields for shorter term investments, higher required yields for longer term investments. So if you look at the graph in the upper right, you will see what we call a normal yield curve. This is the most common. It slopes upward as you go out in maturity. That's the most common. That's the easiest one to explain. We'll talk about theories for explaining why yield curves have their particular shapes. The normal yield curve is easy to explain. An inverted yield curve, pretty much what the name suggests. It's an upside down from what we would consider normal. Higher short-term interest rates, lower long-term interest rates. That's illustrated in the lower left. So you can see that as the term to maturity increases as we move to the right, the curve slopes downward. Yield curves like this happen occasionally, don't tend to stick around for a long time. More difficult to explain than normal yield curves. We'll talk about that again in a moment. And finally, on the bottom right, we have what we call a humped yield curve, where for short times to maturity, we have a lower required yield. As the time to maturity moves out, as it increases, the yield starts to increase, but after some point, the curve becomes inverted and starts going down. So we have lower yields for some higher maturities. So these are just different shapes. You need to know what the adjectives are. You need to know what they mean, because on the exam they could very well be talking about the different shapes of the yield curve. Now, one question that you should be asking yourself is, why would a yield curve have one particular shape over another? And there are various theories that have tried to explain this. Some of these theories are better than others. The three about which you need to know are what we call the pure expectations theory, the liquidity preference or the liquidity premium theory, and the market segmentation theory. Pure expectations, this one is very easy to understand. It says that the shape of the yield curve is determined by expectations of future short-term rates. So the pure expectations theory would say that the 1 year rate that we have starting a year from now is our best indication of what we think the 1 year interest rate will be, the 1 year spot rate, when we move a year into the future. So they're saying that today's interest rates tell us about the expectations that people have of future interest rates. If our forward rates are higher in the future than they are now, it's because we expect interest rates are going to be going up in the future. If our forward rates are lower than now, we expect that interest rates are going to be going down in the future. That's pure expectations. The liquidity preference or liquidity premium theory suggests that if people lend money for a longer period of time, they're going to require a premium for that. They're happy lending at low interest rates for a short period of time, but if their money is going to be tied up longer, they need to be paid extra for that. Because they need a premium for longer term yields, the liquidity preference theory does a good job at explaining a normal yield curve, an upward sloping yield curve. It has a much more difficult time trying to explain a flat or even worse, an inverted yield curve. Pure expectations, that can explain pretty much any shape of a yield curve. Liquidity preference, good job at explaining normal yield curves, not so good job at explaining pretty much any other shape. The third theory that we have is what's called the market segmentation theory. The market segmentation theory is a supply and demand theory. It says that specific kinds of investors have specific maturities at which they like to invest. An example would be, let's say, an insurance company who may have specific liabilities they plan to fund and therefore want to invest in securities that are going to mature at exactly the times they need money to fund these liabilities. So they may have liabilities coming due in 5 years. They're going to want to invest in securities that will mature in 5 years. And they would be willing to accept a slightly lower yield to get the maturity that they want. But if you want to move them from one maturity to another, then you have to pay a premium. So if they want 5 years, they would accept a lower yield. But if you want them to go to either a 4-year maturity or a 6-year maturity, and they only want 5, they would say, no, if you want to push us one way or the other, you're going to have to pay us a little extra yield to get us out of the segment that we want. Market segmentation theory can explain pretty much any shape to a yield curve. It's simply a matter of supply and demand. How much demand is there for short-term, medium-term, long-term bonds? The more demand, the higher the price, and the lower the interest rate, and so on. So these are the three theories for the term structure of interest rates. Okay, Treasury spot rates. The Treasury spot curve is the yield curve that is used to discount single payments. So if you have a single payment coming a year from now, a single payment coming 18 months from now, a single payment coming 5 years from now, and it's a Treasury payment, so it is considered a risk-free payment. You don't have to worry about default risk, you don't have to worry about credit risk, and so on. Then the appropriate interest rate to use to discount that cash flow back to today would be the Treasury spot rate for the maturity that corresponds to the day when that payment is going to be made. Conceptually, this is like zero coupon bond rates. If you had a zero coupon Treasury bond that matures in 5 years, well, it has a single payment that's coming in 5 years. You would discount that single payment back to today at the spot rate appropriate for a Treasury being paid 5 years from now. One other thing to remember about these Treasury curves is that the yield, remember, the yield that we show on here is a bond equivalent yield. So it's always a semi-annual discount rate that has been doubled to get an annual rate. It's not an effective annual rate. It doesn't compound over 6-month periods. We calculate a 6-month discount rate and then we double it to get the annual rate. That's the Treasury spot curve. Some measures of yield spreads. By a yield spread, we mean the difference between the yield on one kind of bond versus the yield on a comparable bond. Most often when we talk about yield spreads, we're talking about spreads on a bond of a particular maturity that is a non-Treasury bond compared to the yield on a Treasury bond of the same maturity. So we might talk about the yield spread of, say, a 5-year corporate bond versus a 5-year Treasury bond, or a 3-year corporate bond versus a 3-year Treasury bond, or a 10-year municipal bond versus a 10-year Treasury bond. That's what we mean when we're talking about yield spreads. Now, there are various ways that we can measure yield spreads. One way of measuring the yield spread is what we call the absolute spread. Conceptually, very easy. We simply take the higher yield, subtract the lower yield. So if we had, let's say, a yield on a 5-year corporate bond of 6.5% and the yield on the 5-year Treasury bond is 5%, 6.5 minus 5, a 1.5% absolute spread. Easy to compute. Not necessarily conceptually the best spread to use, but it's a very easy one to compute, therefore it's very common. The relative spread is the yield on the subject bond, so in this case the yield on the corporate bond, divided by the yield on the benchmark, the Treasury bond, minus 1. So if we had the corporate bond, 5-year corporate with a yield of 6.5%, 5-year Treasury with a yield of 5%, we would take 6.5 divided by 5, which gives us 1.3, minus 1 gives us 0.3. That's the relative spread. The yield ratio, notice the calculation on the yield ratio is the same except it doesn't subtract the 1. So 6.5% on our corporate bond divided by 5% on our treasury bond, 1.3. So the yield ratio is always 1 plus the relative spread. 3 different ways of looking at different yields. Relative spread is generally considered the best of them because it's not sensitive to the level of the yield. It's only sensitive to the differences in the yield. Yield ratio, because it's simply the relative spread plus 1, that's a reasonably good one as well. Absolute spread, generally considered the poorest for a number of reasons we'll talk about in a little while. Okay, some spread calculations. 5-year Treasury yield of 5%. 5-year A-rated corporate yield, 6.25%. Absolute spread, 1.25. 6.25 minus 5. Relative spread, 6.25 divided by 5 minus 1, 25%. Yield ratio, 6.25 divided by 5, 1.25. Notice, as I said earlier, that the difference between the relative spread and the yield ratio is always 1. The yield ratio is 1 plus the relative spread. Very easy to calculate. Make sure that you get the 3 of them straight, because on the exam they could easily ask you for one of these, let's say the relative spread, and give you as one of the wrong answers the yield ratio. And if you don't remember which one is which, you could easily get this wrong. So make sure you study these and get clear in your mind which one is which. All right, now we'll go to credit spreads. These are spreads that result simply from differing credit ratings on bonds. Generally, these are quoted as a spread to treasuries. So we have a treasury, which of course has the highest credit rating, and some other bonds, could be corporate bonds, could be municipal bonds, whatever, that have slightly lower credit rating. Everything else is considered exactly the same. The coupon rate is the same, and the payment schedule and everything is considered the same. It's simply a difference in the credit rating that causes the difference in the yield. Typically, during economic expansions, credit spreads tend to narrow. During economic expansions, people are a little bit more willing to take risk. Therefore, they're more willing to buy corporate bonds, which are considered more risky than treasury bonds. And if they're more willing to buy those, they're going to require a lower rate of return. Therefore, the spreads tend to narrow. During contractions and recessions, when people tend to be a lot more risk averse, they generally want the security of treasury bonds. They're less inclined to buy the corporate bonds. So the prices on the corporate bonds will decrease because there's less demand for them. When the price decreases, the required yield increases. That increases the credit spread. If you have a bond with embedded options, that too could affect the credit spread. If you have options that favor the bondholder, these would include a put option where you could require that the issuer repurchase the bond, or a conversion option where you could convert the bond into, say, shares of stock, or an exchange option where you could exchange the bond for shares of stock. That tends to decrease the yield spread. Remember that I say this anytime we talk about options, and this is something good to write down. Write down these 3 words. If you haven't written these down before, write down these 3 words down at the bottom. Options have value. Always, options have value. If you have a bond with a put option, The put option is owned by the bondholder. The bondholder has to pay for that option. They get something of value, they have to pay for it. The way that they pay for it, one of two ways. They either pay a higher price for the bond, or they accept a lower interest rate, a lower coupon rate for the bond. Either way, if they pay a higher price or they get a lower coupon, that decreases the yield on the bond. So everything else being equal, the yield on bonds with options that favor the bondholder, put options, conversions options, exchange options, are going to have a lower yield and therefore a lower spread to treasuries. If you have options that favor the issuer, call options would be an example, or prepayment options like on a mortgage-backed security. These are options that favor the issuer. Once again, options have value. The issuer has to pay for a call option or a prepayment option. They pay either by accepting a lower price for the bond, or they pay by having a higher coupon rate on the bond. Either way, the yield on that bond increases over a comparable bond without the call or prepayment option, and that increases the yield spread. So options favoring the bondholder, yield spreads decrease. Options favoring the issuer, yield spreads increase. Liquidity also has an effect on yields. Generally, investors prefer more liquidity to less liquidity, so the more liquid a bond, the less yield they're going to require, therefore the lower yield spread. Conversely, the less liquid, the more difficult it would be to sell a bond, then the higher the return, the higher the yield the investor is going to require, and the greater the yield spread over treasuries. Most of this stuff is fairly easy. If you just reason out, if the bond is more liquid, is it more likely, is the investor going to pay a higher price or a lower price? If he pays a higher price, that means a lower yield. If he pays a lower price, a higher yield. Most of this is fairly easy to reason out. And I want you to go through this reasoning and make sure you understand it, so that on the fly, when you're taking the exam, if you don't remember this just because you've memorized it, you can reason it out. And it's probably better for you if you reason it out anyway. If you compare two bond issues, a very large issue versus a very small issue, large issues typically have more liquidity. There are more buyers out there, right? There are more owners of the bonds, typically more buyers, typically higher liquidity. Higher liquidity leads to lower yields, and therefore lower yield spreads versus smaller issues. So there you have it. All right, taxable equivalent yields, after-tax yields. If you have a taxable yield versus on one bond versus a non-taxable yield on another bond, the question is, how do those yields compare? How do you determine which one is better? How do you determine what would be the equivalent yield on one bond versus the other? The only way to do this is you have to get both of them measured the same way. You have to get both of them measured before tax, or you have to get both of them measured after tax. So if you have a taxable yield and you want to know what your after-tax yield is, then you take the taxable yield. Let's say you have a bond that's paying 6%, but it's taxable. So you take that 6% yield and you multiply it by 1 minus the marginal tax rate. Remember, you use the marginal tax rate, not the average tax rate. On an exam problem, they could easily give you both the marginal rate and the average rate. Cross out that average rate, you're not going to use it. It's the marginal rate that matters. The rate that you have to pay on the next dollar that you earn. Take 1 minus the marginal rate, multiply that by the 6% taxable yield, that gives you the after-tax yield. How much money are you going to be able to put in your pocket after you pay the taxes on it? Conversely, if you have a tax-free yield, for example, the yield on a municipal bond, and you want to know what kind of yield would I have to get on a taxable bond to get the same benefit, well, you take the tax-free yield, divide it by 1 minus the marginal tax rate. That gives you the taxable equivalent yield. So if you're given one bond that is taxable, one bond that is tax exempt, and you're asked which one is better, you either have to convert the tax exempt bond to a tax exempt yield to a taxable yield by dividing by 1 minus the marginal rate, or you have to convert the taxable yield to an after-tax yield by multiplying by 1 minus the marginal tax rate before you can compare those two numbers. Here's an example. We have a tax-free bond that yields 4% and a taxable bond that yields 7%. And our investor's marginal tax rate is 30%. Which bond would the investor prefer? This is simply a question of which of these bonds is going to give our investor the most money in his pocket after he's paid for everything. Our after-tax yield on the taxable bond, we take 7%, the taxable yield, and we multiply it by 1 minus 0.3, 1 minus the marginal tax rate. So for every dollar that he gets in taxable yield, he's going to get to keep only 70 cents, 0.7, 1 minus 0.3. For every dollar in taxable yield, he keeps 0.7. So if he has a 7% taxable yield times 0.7, he gets a 4.9% after-tax yield. The tax-free bond is paying him only 4%. 4.9 is better than 4. That tells you that the taxable bond is better than the after-tax. We could have done it the other way around. We could have said that if he's getting a 4% tax-free yield, what would be the equivalent taxable yield? So he's only keeping 70 cents out of every dollar, but he gets 4% when he keeps 70 cents out of every dollar. How much would he have to get before taxes to get to that? 4% divided by 0.7 gives us 5.71. So our tax-free yield of 4% is equivalent to a taxable yield of 5.71. So you're going to do one of two things. You're going to compare 4.9 to 4, and that tells you the taxable bond is better. Or you're going to compare 7 to 5.71. That tells you that the taxable bond is better. No matter which way you slice it, no matter whether you go from A to B or B to A, the taxable bond is better, and there's your answer. Either way, you want to get the taxable bond. LIBOR. LIBOR is an abbreviation, it's an acronym for the London Interbank Offered Rate. This is a rate that banks use to charge interest to each other when they are borrowing from one bank to another. It is the most common rate, used as a reference rate for floating rate securities. So if you have a floating rate bond, it's most likely that the interest rate that that bond is paying is going to be based off of some LIBOR rate. If you have a swap, when we get to derivatives, we will talk about swaps. If we have a floating component in our swap, it's most likely that the floating rate used on that swap will be based off of some LIBOR rate. Now, there are LIBOR rates for all different maturities. There's a 6-month LIBOR rate, and a 1-year LIBOR rate, and a 2-year LIBOR rate, and a 5-year LIBOR rate. You have a LIBOR yield curve, just like the yield curves, the Treasury yield curves we were talking about earlier. And there are LIBOR rates for all different currencies. There are LIBOR rates for dollars, and there are LIBOR rates for euros, and LIBOR rates for yen, and so on. One example of how you might use LIBOR is a funded investor who is going to borrow money short term and use that money to finance some sort of investment position. We were talking about this in another study session where we were considering how to compute your leveraged return. If you borrowed money and then used the proceeds of that borrowing to make an investment, how do you calculate what the return is on the dollars that you contributed? This is the sort of thing that a funded investor is doing. They're borrowing money, typically at LIBOR, and using that to finance an investment. Obviously, they want to earn more on the investment than the interest is costing them on LIBOR, and the profits are going to depend on that. The higher the interest rate at which they can invest, or the lower the interest rate at which they can borrow, the greater their profits. So the profits will depend not only on how much they get from their investment, how much they earn on that, but also is going to depend on the LIBOR rate. The lower the LIBOR rate, the more money that they make. Investors like that. And that wraps it up for this reading. I will see you a little bit later on another one.